It is always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, for me to welcome our next guest to this program. She is the 2014 Hillman Prize winner, the proprietor of one of my favorite blogs. She writes at salon.com. Heather Digby Parton. Hello, Heather.
Hi, Sam. You can call me Digby.
Digby. I know. Sometimes like there's like just a slight hesitation. But Digby,
Yes.
you wrote a piece about this interview that one of President Obama's longtime advisors, Dan Pfeiffer, gave to Jonathan Chait at the New York magazine, or at New Yorker magazine, New York magazine, excuse me. Geez. And you wrote about that, and I have to say, like, I am a little bit annoyed at how little attention that interview has gotten. But let's save that for a moment. Tell us about that interview and why it's relevant to folks like you and I.
Well, it was conducted with Dan Pfeiffer, who is one of, President Obama's longtime advisors and associates going all the way back to the 2008 campaign. He's left, for greener pastures. I mean, I think all these advisors burn out after a while. He's been there for a long time. And by all accounts, is very, very close to President Obama. So I have to assume that he's not just, speaking out of turn here, that he's someone who had great access and insight into the inner workings of the White House. And in the interview, it was actually rather shocking to me that we finally had somebody sort of admitting what had happened and showed some actual awareness of how this had happened. And essentially, this is what it was. They said that, he admits they came into office with this idea that they had a special talent for reaching out and achieving some kind of bipartisan, transpartisan agreement with the Republicans. And they could, they felt that the problems in the past had been part of some, apparently a part of some, other dynamic that they were going to be able to overcome. And so they believed that they would be able to reach some kind of agreement with the Republicans. And they worked very hard at it, as as we all recall. They managed to pass the health care bill with not one Republican voting for it. They barely managed to pass the stimulus bill, which was, essential to keep the country functioning. And so, but for whatever reason, they came back out of that still thinking that they were going to have to, they were going to make some headway with Republicans, despite that particular thing that had gone on in the early days. And that's when, of course, we all followed this story, Simpson Bowles, and they were going to have the grand bargain, and we're going to, they did all of that. And, of course, it didn't work, as we all know. And, in fact, it ended up setting, putting something on the menu that was actually very destructive to Democrats in general. And, we'll see how that works out down the road. In this interview, he says that it took them that long to figure out that Republicans weren't operating on some kind of, grand strategic basis. That basically, John Boehner doesn't have a long game. He's just trying to get through the day, which I think was clear to all of us who were watching it from afar. There didn't seem to be any plan, not to mention the fact that, he was, it was clear that no matter what Obama did, they were going to oppose it. And this seemed to be clear from the very, very beginning. Now, apparently during this whole period, there were advisors in the White House, many of whom came from the Clinton administration, and they had learned this lesson that you had to appeal to the middle, that you absolutely, that the base was irrelevant, that, no matter what was going on, you had to, work hard at not alienating the great, independent, real Americans out there. And at some point after I think it was after the 2012 election, the Obama administration apparently decided that that wasn't such a great idea, and they started going for a more unilateral approach with, carrying the base and trying to actually initiate, liberal policies. Now, he says that happened after 2012. I think it was actually after 2014 where we've seen the real action on that, because, I mean, maybe a little bit after 2012, but it was because they hedged on the immigration thing before 2014, as you recall. And then afterwards immediately went and did it. But the idea being that he said that they decided that worrying about that didn't make any difference, and says whenever we contemplate bold progressive action, you got hemming and hawing in advance about what it was going to mean. Is it going to alienate people? What will it mean in the red state? And then he says this. He said, and yet it's always proved overblown. Quote, there's never been a time when we've taken progressive action and regretted it. Well, I read this and I thought, oh my God, because, those of us, people like you and people like me, and those of us who've been observing the dynamic for the last, too long, for a couple of decades, there was nothing new in this. I mean, I was really taken aback by the fact that the liberal, the progressive base that was out there knew this from the very beginning. We'd been observing Republicans being, insane for a very long time. There was no indication they were ever going to do this. And in fact, they were ever going to cooperate with Obama. And in fact, during the 2008 campaign, one of the more annoying aspects of the Obama, pitch to the public was he had this, special ability to do this, which seemed absurd to a lot of us. We were kind of saying, no, wait a minute, that's not going to work. You were voted in as a progressive, an unabashed progressive in the minds of your followers anyway.
Right.
And certainly on a symbolic level, I think no one would have been surprised to see Barack Obama be a progressive president. And yet you think that you're going to be able to come in and change the entire dynamic of Washington by your mere presence. That's not going to happen. And what you need to do is just take, as Dan Pfeiffer says, take unilateral progressive action. And had he done that, they would have not regretted it. So anyway, that's the substance of the interview and why I was taken aback by it, because it's the first time I've heard anybody indicate. I mean, you recall Robert Gibbs, who was the former press secretary. He was so very dismissive of what he termed the professional left. Anytime that we would kind of go, hey guys, this isn't working, and you need to stop doing this stuff and wasting a lot of time. And when you go back to that 2011. Deficit reduction grand bargain negotiation session. That was a real low point. It was a real low point, and it basically stymied whatever. At the end of the day, it stymied whatever forward progress we had made in terms of any kind of domestic policy, and a lot of people suffered for it. So I've never heard any member of the administration admit, at least quite that boldly, what a mistake that had been.
It's and the interesting thing to me about it, I mean, there's so many different ways to sort of read, and we can't obviously get into Dan Pfeiffer's head, and we can't get into the president's head, and I, and maybe at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Like the fact that he is assessing it this way is really, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters. I don't know if I totally believe it. I mean, but to the extent that I do, in other words, he's saying, look, we made some tactical mistakes, right? I mean, ultimately, that's what he's saying, it seems to me. We made some tactical mistakes. But I'm not convinced that their sort of like strategic goals weren't what they were going, that the tactics might have been a mistake, broadly speaking, in terms of politics, but I'm not convinced that their strategic goals were necessarily aligned with progressives in the same way. And maybe that's irrelevant to a certain extent, just because, look, if it's being assessed this way, really, at this point, we're just like, how is this going to implicate things going forward, right? I mean, and that's the real issue, I guess. But I mean, do you think that he's being? Do you think it was just a simple matter of this is where we work tactically, and maybe maybe the different split here is that, and I've, I think maybe you referenced this in your piece, but I've heard people say, like, the bottom line is that there was a sort of Clinton apparatus that existed, right? Like for years leading up to that election, people thought it was going to be Hillary Clinton, and by people I mean the Washington sort of people referred to the Center for American Progress as the Clinton administration in exile. You had this whole Clinton apparatus. And when he became president, he just basically adopted that, much to the chagrin, I think, of us. But that it was still their lessons that sort of hung over the place in some way.
Well, and I think Pfeiffer even admits that. I mean, he says that the advice that he would get around town was that you had to
triangulate, basically.
Triangulate, and that they adopted that. Now, I don't know what their actual belief system was. I mean, maybe they didn't even have a strategic vision in that way. I do think that they came in with the idea. I mean, certainly everything that we heard at the time, they came in with the idea that they had a unique ability to deal with Republicans. Right. And you remember that was a big part of their pitch, that, when he was in Springfield in Illinois, he, sat in a room and gotten all this stuff passed with Republicans, and how he'd gotten conservatives on the Harvard Law Review to, come together and work with him.
He met with lawmakers and he said, the difference is you got me, type of thing.
Yeah, the difference is you've got me. And that, he was very, the idea was that it was something unique to him that was going to make this thing work. Now, did they believe that? It's hard to say. I mean, I know that over the years that I've written that it sure looked like they believed their own hype over and over again. And, I was skeptical of it from the beginning, as I know you were, because we've been watching these, the way that this stuff works, and that's just not the case. Now, Pfeiffer in his interview, one thing I didn't mention, says that it's all about the incentive structure. And the incentive structure meaning, when you look at, in the Republican case, the gerrymandering, the power of the Tea Party, their media structure. I'm assuming that's what he means. He didn't get explicit there. He just called it the incentive structure. And I agree with that. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why people, in Congress do things that have nothing to do with the personalities involved, or what, like they always talk about, Tip and Ronnie got together and, threw down a couple of scotches, and that's how they got deals done. I mean, that's just really kind of nonsense. I mean, there is a power structure. It works in a particular way, and we're in a period in which the two parties have, there's very little overlap ideologically between them, or regionally between them, or anything. I mean, this is like they are existing as two, power centers that are kind of fighting with one another, essentially. And so, that idea that you're going to be able to massage these, rough issues is kind of ridiculous. But who didn't know that?
Right.
As I put in my piece, I'm like, look, what we were looking at when Obama came into office, we were looking at a period, an entire decade almost with Bill Clinton, where the right had pulled out every single stop on a political level to actually force him from office, even to the point where they impeached him over kind of a nonsensical issue that they found to impeach him over. They worked themselves up into a frenzy. During that period, yes, there was still enough of an overlap between the two parties that they were able to, do some legislating together. And Bill Clinton was extremely willing to do legislation with them, trade legislation, welfare reform, a lot of things that they wanted. And in those days, there was still enough of a hangover of the idea that, let's take a little bit of what we can get, and then we'll move on to the next step.
Right, and in those days, you also still had people like Lincoln Chafee, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, there was like a different species that existed at that time.
And don't forget, you have people like, Bob Kerrey and David Boren. And,
right.
There were a lot of, very right-wing Democrats that were still left in office. And that was then. And nonetheless, there was no doubt that the Republicans had gone crazy. By 2000,
Yep.
they were willing to use whatever political lever they had, including, their brother's the president elect, the presidential nominee, his brother's political machine, to get over the line. And the Supreme Court stepped in and gave the most partisan Supreme Court decision in history to install him in office. And then they started a war.
Right.
For no good reason. I mean, there was nothing in any of that wasn't clear to people who were observing, that there was something was different. There was no longer, you weren't dealing with a party that was operating on a sort of a, they had long-term goals. There's no doubt about that. I mean, they wanted to invade Iraq for many years. They wanted to destroy Social Security. There are a lot of things they'd like to do. But as far as they're having this, this great, 10-dimensional chess game going on, it was obvious that they were totally being opportunistic whenever the moment came that they could, appease their base or respond to the incentives, as Pfeiffer puts it. That's what they were going to do. So I never got it, why anyone would think that you could just thwart that with some kind of, I don't know, special personality that would enable all of this to fall by the wayside. Those incentives were obvious for a very long time, and they were being rewarded over and over and over again during that same period, from the early 90s to the point where Obama came into office. The right wing had built up this tremendous infrastructure. It was extremely powerful. It had led us into a war against, at least half the country and most of the world's will.
Right.
And it had done it anyway. So I still find it, I found it very difficult to believe that they didn't understand that. Now, yes, to your question, whether or not this is all kind of, trying to cover that up in some way and saying, well, we were just kind of observing the tactical maneuvers, and this is what we came up with. I don't know.
Right.
It was a big mistake. Let's just put it that way. I think it was a big mistake.
And what's even more important, I think, for going forward is that you have at least one person, one advisor close to President Obama coming out and saying explicitly it was a mistake. It was a miscalculation. Yeah. And, he sloughs it off a little bit like, we thought that there was a partner there in Boehner, but we found out that he couldn't deliver even when we were basically giving him the House. And I want to get back to that incentive structure because Chait writes, many political journalists imagine that the basic tension for the White House lies between Obama's liberal base and appealing to the Americans at the center, who will be crucial for tipping elections. Pfeiffer believes the dynamic is, in fact, the opposite. The incentive structure moves from going after the diminishing middle to motivating the base. And, I can see he claims that they sort of came to this realization in 2012. I'm not so convinced, right? I mean, they specifically punted the immigration executive order till after the election. They did come out, I guess, in 2012, and we want the American Jobs Creation Act, but 2013 budget, I think it was, had the changed CPI, the cuts to the cost of living increases Social Security. I mean, that's why I think the timeline, as he's saying this, like I'm not quite sure I believe it. Again, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because certainly in the past, I'm just trying to do this calculation, less than 5 months, we've gotten, not necessarily they haven't all been executed, but we've gotten, from a progressive standpoint, from a liberal perspective, some pretty good things. I mean, net neutrality, I think that's something that's going to resonate for years and years to come. I mean, we're still suffering under the Telecommunications Act in '96, as far as I'm concerned. Things like the deferred action that's been held up, but that's by no fault of the Obama administration. It's because of a judge. There's the pact with China, Cuba relations. I mean, it goes on. And I guess the real question then moving forward is there's a couple questions. I've been struck by how little, and you and I sort of like inhabit some of the same, I guess, virtual spaces online. How little attention this has gotten, right? Because for a long time, the notion of what Pfeiffer had said, if Pfeiffer said this 3 years ago, he would have been laughed at by a lot of people. And I'm not even convinced he wouldn't have been laughed at by Chait, frankly.
Oh, he would have been. Are you kidding?
Well, that's what's sort of fascinating is like this is all presented like it's just another day in the neighborhood, and none of like, wow, boy, I guess I was really wrong on all the premises I've had for the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and how about that Green Lanternism, huh?
Yes,
I mean,
well,
I've been
tell people, tell people tell people what that means, because what that idea is, Green Lanternism, because we get this a lot when we say like President Obama can do certain things, and at the very least he can take certain positions, and then you're accused of Green Lanternism. What does that mean?
Well, it was, I think it was coined by Matt Iglesias sometime back in the 2000s. I don't remember what specifically it was, but it was the idea that the president can magically get things done. Am I right? I mean, is
yes.
it any more complicated than that? And this is, of course, they derived this as a complete illusion that the president has no, and basically it had morphed in the Obama years, especially during this period that we've been talking about, where he was, trying vainly to get to pass legislation with the Republicans. That it was that those people who insisted that maybe the president would be wise to use whatever levers of power he had, for instance, with appointments, with regulations, many of the things he's doing now, and certainly by coming out with, without equivocating about his progressive goals and trying to make the case to the public that this was what he was trying to do, and using whatever means available. And, the president does have a whole branch of government to himself with a gigantic administrative apparatus that one would think could be put to use in periods when the Congress is in gridlock. That we were told, those of us who made that argument, and progressives who thought that was a good idea, i.e. what he's doing now, we're told that we were foolish, delusional people. The presidency is basically, I used to make this joke all the time on my blog, that, it's just kind of a symbolic office, sort of like the Queen.
Right.
You can't really do anything. You go to ribbon-cutting ceremonies and give speeches, about nice things, and that's about it. And that's basically what we were told for years, that the president had no power. And, that all of you people who, keep wanting him to do it and, saying, oh, he just needs to lead. I don't remember anybody serious saying that. In fact, it was kind of the silly, mainstream press who would say stupid things like that.
Right.
These were, the critique was that it was clear that the Congress was not going to do anything. And if they did, it would be terrible. Whatever it was they did would not be worth doing in terms of, passing any kind of change. The best you could hope for was to keep the status quo until they sobered up. And so what the president needed to do was to use this gigantic branch and big administrative apparatus that he has to do other things and do what he could and make the case to the people. And we were derided as complete fools. And not only that, making the case to the people, by the way, is also a joke because it's called the bully pulpit, which the president can't be a bully because, he doesn't have that kind of power. He can't get up there. Of course, the bully pulpit was not about bullying in the way we currently think of it. It came about because Theodore Roosevelt said it, and bully was more like an exhortation, a kind of a cheerleading.
Right,
kind
bully
of thing.
on you.
Bully for you, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so it was kind of a misunderstanding about the very essential meaning of the word, the bully pulpit, and what it was supposed to do. And, those of us who thought, if you can't get anything done, at least make the case, because this is, the president has a huge platform. He can talk about things. People do listen to him. If they hear it enough, they'll absorb it, and this will become kind of part, it will be out in the ether, and it will become part of the way people understand politics. somebody's got to say this stuff. And instead, all you heard was, the usual nonsense that you hear on cable TV, about appealing to the middle and the real Americans. And,
what's fascinating about this with Pfeiffer is that what he is admitting is not, I mean, put aside the fact that he says this is a mistake, right? He says this was a choice. And so this is really the part that I think is really sort of crucial for people to understand. And I wish it would there was even, frankly, there's not. I mean, people have written about this interview, but I mean, you're the only person who has sort of written it from this sort of perspective. Pfeiffer's saying we made a choice. So if they made an affirmative choice to do X, which in this instance was to go and to negotiate and try and meet them halfway and this and that, you can argue that it was right or wrong, but it was clearly a choice. So it means that the other choice, and there could have been multiple other choices, were actually valid choices as well, at least insofar as, maybe not strategically, people can argue about that, but there was another route to take. I mean, because the thing that we heard the most about in terms of Green Lanternism wasn't just a criticism about what you perceive will happen. It is a criticism of what you believe should even be attempted. And insofar as there is no, I mean, the argument wasn't just that you're fantastical in what you think the results are going to be. It is you're fantastical and think that there's any other route to take here. Yeah. And so Pfeiffer's not only saying we made a mistake, but he's laying that essential foundation that there was a choice we made. We could have gone strategically one way, and we could have gone strategically or tactically another way, and we went one way, and that was a big mistake. And so it just it's such a huge revelation on some level, or not a revelation per se but it is such an important building block because, I would like to see, someone in Clinton world address this dynamic in some fashion because it's not going to happen. I understand.
Well, I know, but
that's Green Lanternism. But
I mean, I wrote this at the end of my piece. This is really important because I think people are going under the assumption that Hillary Clinton, of all people, understands in a way perhaps Obama did not what she's up against. And that was one of the arguments for her in 2008. I don't know, whatever. But I don't think there's any doubt that she's not naive about the nature of the opposition. I suspect she gets it. But what I don't know is if she has learned any of that other lesson about how, this is not the 90s anymore. There is no way to do that stuff she's going to follow the pattern of her husband and herself. She was in the administration too. How they handled that and how they approached that was to try and do exactly what President Obama tried to do, and it didn't work. And I have no clue whether or not she has learned that lesson and understands that this is now about base motivation. It is about rallying your own troops. It is about finding a way to do what needs to be done, understanding that you are not going to be, at least for the near term. Republicans, like I said, they may sober up at some point, but at the moment, this is just not happening. And as they are acting increasingly nuts, as we saw with this letter to Iran this week, the Democrats are going to kind of, circle the wagons as well. So, we're probably going to see some increased polarization, which is hard to believe it's possible, but I do think that's what's going to happen, which means that the president has a completely different task ahead of her if she becomes than President Clinton had during his time. And I have no idea whether or not that has penetrated in any way in Clinton world. And whether, maybe Dan Pfeiffer is sending a message, hey guys,
right.
Wake up because this has happened and you better know what you're getting into. But I don't know. And, and until, we're going to be talking about, emails and other silly stuff rather than trying to find this out, I think. I mean, I don't know when we're going to be able to ask these questions.
Well,
So,
I'll tell you something. This whole email thing, and I want to talk to you about that. And if we run up against the time, maybe we'll just carry this over into the second half of the program, because if you don't mind, if you have time.
No, of course, no. I'm fine.
Because all of this Pfeiffer stuff is really important, I think. But its greatest importance, of course, is to whether or not the next Democratic nominee president gets this message. And really, I think, part of that person getting that message is also that the sort of center left, a machine, to the extent that there is one, gets this message too. And it strikes me, this has been such a weird sort of, this whole email thing has been sort of fascinating in a couple of ways, because we never had, with President Obama, I guess the closest that anything like this came was Reverend Wright, where they were sort of besieged, but Reverend Wright was is a real guy who really said those things. They were sort of taken out of context. And I think, for many people, it was, I was like, oh, this is what I'm hoping for. I'm actually hoping that President Obama sat into Reverend Wright's pew and at the very least absorbed some of what was being talked about here. And I think when he came out and basically said, here is Reverend Wright, et cetera, like it deflated everything, because it's not like he's my hidden uncle. He's my, he said he's my crazy uncle, and everybody's got one, and here he is, and we invite him to dinner, and I listen to some of the things he says, and other things whatnot. Ultimately, I'm not convinced that he listened to anything, but it is weird to me that the Clintons somehow, like, we've already got the first, whatever it is, digital archive gate. And there's going to be multiple more of these. I think, I have one theory that says that cable news will just exhaust themselves and won't go down this wormhole again, but maybe not. But I guess one of the things that struck me about all of this, and I was on Hayes' show talking about it. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I don't think there's that much, such a big deal here, but I've also was sort of like, wow, they, it seems to me maybe there was a way for them to sort of nip this in the bud, and they didn't. But it also occurs to me, the reason why it got so far with Clinton in terms of the impeachment, I'm quite convinced, is that the base of the Democratic Party was just not interested in defending him. And because he was not delivering for the base in the same way. I mean, I think people basically defended him against the excess of the Republicans. But, I certainly am not motivated to go on there and, to go out into the world and, expend every bit of energy I can to defend the Clinton email non-scandal. I'm just like, this is what it is. But I think they still don't get that they didn't have that fundamental, flank covered. Do you know what I'm saying? Does that make any sense or no?
I do, but I don't know that they actually don't think they do. I mean, 538 just put out some kind of a, whatever they do, polling or some kind of analysis that showed that, the party is still behind her 100%. Nobody cares. She's got, I think that's what, ends up happening all the time is that, I think you're right about Lewinsky, that was kind of a, oh my God. And nobody wanted to touch it. It was iffy, and people didn't want to actually, be in a position. It was a very difficult position to be defending somebody about. Let's just put it that way. And so, I think they do have the backing of the Democrats, and I think And, I don't know how strategic they are about any of this, but it's entirely possible. I think that they might think that there's a positive to it. It's kind of like the more they get beaten, the more, and especially when the right starts to go crazy and the press starts to act like, a bunch of One Direction fans squealing daily about this stuff, that, the base then starts to rally around her. And I don't know where they are. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine anybody likes this other than, I do see the right wing is very excited about it. Needless to say, that was the whole setup of Benghazi was for this purpose. This is why they have an ongoing committee on Benghazi, which has been settled, even by the committee. It's been settled, but they're still doing it anyway. It's so that they have an apparatus to issue subpoenas and, drop, leak to the press, these little things. And it's, obviously part of what, that there really is a plan about this.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think
Benghazi is a plan.
Definitely. I think that his name now is Gowdy. Gowdy's committee is just a scandal-making machine. Is basically
it's
a
like
fake.
Dan Burton's committee was back in the 90s.
Indeed.
And and obviously it still does work. The press gets very excited about this, and I wish I could explain to you
why it works with the Clintons and not Obama. Because Obama has not. Is it? I wonder if it isn't like in some way that that the Republicans, when chasing scandal with the Obama administration, almost like couldn't help themselves but always gravitate towards somehow making it about race. You know what I mean? Like they couldn't.
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's really that simple. And I think
and that is more, I guess, sort of like that sets off more alarm bells to the media, and they don't feel as comfortable pursuing the fact that he's not, really a citizen, or that it just makes the Republicans just too stupid. Like literally, they keep gravitating, like they can't help themselves, but they keep sort of gravitating back to his race on some level. If that's why they couldn't get anything that would get even, they already have more traction on this email thing than they had on really any supposed scandal with the Obama administration.
Oh, yeah. It's far more, and I could sense it from the beginning. And I actually wrote it. I went, Benghazi's the one. For, the IRS thing, they love that because they were victimized by the big bad government, allegedly, even though they weren't. And, it's the IRS and it's about taxes and all that has a certain sexy currency on the right. But Benghazi, of course, from the beginning. In fact, I put, when I write it, I always put it with an exclamation point at the end and a trademark symbol.
Right.
Because it is a trademark, scandal. And of course, the reason it works is because Hillary Clinton is attached to it. You can see people, even some of the old-time reporters, Andrew Mitchell, for instance. You can see that she kind of can't help herself following it. But at the same time, she's been doing a little bit of sort of historical backgrounding on this thing in a way that others aren't. And as you say, when you say, why didn't they get ahead of it? Mitchell did an interesting show yesterday or the day before, going back to the famous pink suit press conference, which was about Hillary and the cattle futures and Whitewater and all this other nonsense back in the 90s. She came before the press. She sat down in some big, we're in a chair, and the whole press corps was there, and they were looking at her, and she answered questions for an eternity. It was the longest press conference I've ever seen in my life. Every question was answered. By the time they were done, the press corps was exhausted, and everyone had said to her ahead of time, if you do this, if you just get up there and answer every question, if you just don't avoid it, if you just come before us and lay it all out, that will put an end to most of this, and we'll just carry on. What we need from you is that you face the media and answer every question. She did that, and the town exploded afterwards. There was, all it did, of course, was raise more questions.
Right.
And as Andrew Mitchell points out, this is the lesson the Clintons learned. The more you give, the worse it gets.
Right.
So that is why I think they're not immediately forthcoming. There's not this, there's always this sort of sense of, why don't they nip it in the bud? How come this stuff is allowed to fester? I honestly think they believe that whatever they do, it's going to fester anyway. And if they feed it, it's just going to be worse. So, put it off until you absolutely have to answer questions and then answer them. And then, just wait for the next, for the tidal wave to subside a little bit and then carry on. I mean, this is how they've been conditioned to deal with it. And the press, likewise, has also been conditioned to do this. So, it's like we're just getting, we're in this pattern. I do have to point out one thing. It is the Clintons that seem to bring this out, and it's like this ongoing soap opera that's been, I don't know, boy, historically, this is going to be a very interesting period around them and, how people look at it. But it also happened to Al Gore.
Right.
And, perhaps that.
But that was because Al Gore had, forgive the characterization, Clinton juice on him. Right? I mean,
well, there's that. Yeah, he did. I mean, he did. But there were even aspects of this with Kerry. When they moved on the Swift boat thing in a way that was just kind of insane. The press did. There was kind of a blood in the water feeling there. That you sense it if you've watched it long enough, as you and I both have. That febrile kind of excitement where there's no longer any. It's a feedback loop in among the media where they're just kind of saying what each other is saying, and you can see it. It has its home in cable news, but it also works in the media, in the press, the printed press as well. And I think that there was a little bit of that with him too. Gore got it very badly in a different way. I mean, each of these has their own characteristics, but what it comes from, and this is what I think what the press needs to think hard about on this as they go forward with Hillary. It's not as if none of this is legitimate, and of course it's a congressional committee that's raising all these questions. I mean, you can't just ignore it. I mean, obviously it has to be dealt with, but there have been exposés of the Republican oppo research and opposition,
machine
apparatus,
right.
Machine that they use. It's very, very good. It's very effective. In fact, two of the people who ran the machine against Al Gore are now, in government. Barbara Comstock is a member of Congress now, and Tim Griffin, who was sort of made famous briefly, he was in the Justice Department and was made famous briefly as part of the U.S. attorney scandal. He's now the lieutenant governor of Arkansas. Those two people ran the oppo shop against Al Gore, and there has been, there was a documentary made about it, about how the press would call them up and say, "What have you got for me?" And how they would plant these stories with the press, with the idea of advancing them as these sort of, I mean, it's never anything specific. It's about character. It's about how to show, they build a character of their opponent, and then they feed the press these tidbits of information very systematically to build that caricature that they're trying to build. They did it with Kerry, no doubt about it, the windsurfing, the whole thing. And so, the press needs to be aware of this. And I have noticed in this latest one, what I'm seeing is there's a new generation here who don't know about this. New generation of reporters who they don't know that this is how this stuff has worked, and they sort of took it for granted that this, quote, narrative about Hillary Clinton, that, she's a Machiavellian control freak, bad character, this narrative, they sort of launched right into that without recognizing what that was about. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but they need to at least know where it's coming from, how that works, the whole way the system is. And I'm a little afraid that there's going to be, a big learning curve on this. And the sad thing is, Sam, is that, we're going to do this stuff with Hillary Clinton, and if there's no opponent, and, God knows, I don't see one on the horizon. Maybe, Jim Webb is not going to get the job done. I'm sorry.
Right.
there's going to be no way to talk to her about this other stuff, the important stuff that we really need to hash out.
We're going to have an entire, to the extent that we have any sort of run up to the general election, and then even arguably in the general election, it's all going to be about emails and pantsuits and haircuts and who knows what else, Huma and the assortment of non-relevant things. It's a little bit aggravating. I mean, I'm starting to see now, over the past couple of days, these calls for a legitimate primary against Clinton for the sake of Clinton, really, and which is also is sort of strange. It's just such a strange era, and it's going to be fascinating, I have to say, on some level too, to see if what happens when you have this apparatus that is led by a team that is still sort of, I guess, I mean, it just appears to me that they're still sort of like they're fighting the last war, right? Which was I guess, in some level, the Clinton two-term presidency, but they just don't, there doesn't seem to have been like a makeover from 2008. You know what I mean? There doesn't seem to have been like, hey, this is a different media climate. This is a different, because there is. And it just seems like at one point they may have to make a sort of make a sort of a big decision internally. Like we've got to take a slightly different tact here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope so.
I actually don't think that anything that we've seen is indicative of a weakness as a general election. I think she could win. I don't, like you say, there's 80% still support her in the Democratic Party. I don't know that there's the depth there. I mean, that's, one thing that I think is always very hard to measure. It's just like sort of how motivated are those 80%? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's one thing
I will say this. I think that women in particular, and you'll find this even among her greatest critics, among women, that, there's a sense that, if you want to see a woman president, this is it. There's no other woman who has the resume, the gravitas, the whatever it is, the charisma to become president. And so, the Republicans are crazy. And even if they put up Jeb Bush or some other, what they think is some anodyne mainstream guy, they're not, and they have to answer to this craziness, and they will be crazy, and I don't think there's any doubt about it. That this is a time, this is when you have your opening to get your first. They had it in 2008, and Obama won. Now it's, going to be 2016, and, this is a time for the Democrats to advance this and have a woman president. The opening may not be here. For a very long time.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. And when I talk about the depth on that 80%, I'm not talking about from an electoral standpoint. I actually think that, like, if you've got a very strong relationship with the activist base, and by the activist base, I'm talking like people who really pay attention to politics, who are going to, even if 100 people send, emails to someone who is opining about like, hey, this is way off topic. That impacts stuff. I know that now. What I did not know 10 years ago when I started this is these reporters, people don't contact them. If they get 100 emails, polite emails from people who sound reasonable and say, you're way off base on this, that's going to implicate their reporting. And I just think that, like, they don't understand that they could, or maybe they do understand, they just don't care. Maybe because maybe there is some value to them to deal with this sort of like piddling stuff. Certainly the Obama administration learned, like, hey, the longer we can get them to be talking about the birth certificate, the better. We should never show this birth certificate. We should come out with a fraudulent one just to show the first time, just to see what happens. Maybe that is, the Clinton people feel like, look, there's nothing here. at the end of the day, and let them chase these emails, because it doesn't matter. It does make it look like we're getting beat up over nothing. And as much as Washington is abuzz about this, people outside who don't really pay attention to this stuff either way, they don't care. And but for people like us who really want to sort of start to shape the form of what an administration will look like, it's that much more frustrating.
Well, yeah, and it's exhausting. I mean, honestly, it's an exhausting process. Which is part of what they're trying to evoke is the idea. There was another idea they had, which was called Clinton fatigue, which was just, God, whatever, get her out. I think they're trying to provoke that feeling. That I'm talking about the right wing here,
right?
And I think the press kind of goes along with that. I mean, you tell me, you're in the media. Is part of this? Is there an incentive in the media? Does this do good? Is this good for ratings? I mean, do people tune in because of this stuff? Is that really a? Because I don't honestly know. We didn't have this when this happened before.
I don't know. I mean, my sense is, just from like sort of casually watching MSNBC, is that there is a belief there that it does. I mean, I walked onto the set at Hayes' show the other night, and the graphic was, welcome to your next 20 months or something,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just like, oh. And there, I think that's like I personally just don't think that there's the energy in the media to maintain this. This is not the days of where CNN dictates the narrative, and it's not the days where Fox dictates the narrative. It's the narrative is the ownership of the narrative is more dispersed these days, it seems to me, and I don't think it's going to be as easy to drive this stuff, frankly.
And it's also, we're in a world that has just, there's a lot of noise. I mean, at the same time this email thing was happening, the Republicans were acting like lunatics and sending, letters to the Ayatollah, telling him, you better deal with us, dude, basically. And there's all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, look what just happened in Ferguson last night, and that's going to be a big story. So it's really, I think it's harder to control that storyline, because the world is, the media now is much more, as you said, the narrative is dispersed, and world events are much more immediate, I think, to people. So it may be more difficult to keep the energy going that these scandals really require. I mean, they kind of, burst into flame, and then they would be able to keep them going for a while. Just, here's a little revelation here, here's this, that, and the other, and I'm not quite sure they'll be able to do it. I mean, we're going to see, obviously, this is the way it's going to go. But I just am, I'm sad in a sense, because, what Dan Pfeiffer said is, it's such an important insight, and so important for people who have been working in progressive politics. It was so hard won to come to that understanding that, we're in a new time. This is not about trying to split the difference or, meet people halfway. I'm talking just on a policy level, forgetting the politics of it and, whether or not, Hillary has a narrative or whatever else is going on. But just this idea that in order to affect actual policy that it affects people's lives, that actually makes a difference in the way people live. You have to have an understanding of how this is working, and it's not going to be a matter of. I don't think that Hillary Clinton is going to be able to sit down with Mitch McConnell and hammer out deals.
Right.
That's not going to happen. So how is Hillary Clinton going to do whatever it is? And does she have an interest in doing the things that could make her a successful president and make progressivism a successful ideology during the period when she's in office? I mean, we don't know that. I mean, all we know about her so far is that she has been very cozy with Wall Street. Mm-hmm. Her foreign policy is way more hawkish than the base, at least to the extent that we know about it. And, you know, I think she'll be good on social issues. I have no reason to believe that she won't advance. I mean, I think she'll be very good on women's rights, which God knows is important to me. And I think that that's a real selling point. But, you know, this is an ideological package. It isn't just one thing. And you can't just say that, you know, she's going to be good on this, and so the rest of it should just go unaddressed. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And I don't know, you know, with no primary, and I've never thought there would be one, because I thought that, you know, we had sort of made a collective unconscious decision that she would be the next nominee after 2008 because it was a close primary election. You know, I don't know how this stuff is going to get hashed out, and I think that, you know, everybody's worried about, you know, has Hillary learned anything about how to deal with the press, and is this all going to be, you know, can she handle her scandals? I'd like to know if she's learned anything about, you know, policy.
Yes.
You know, what does she believe about economics in America today, about income inequality, about how the role of government in dealing with that stuff? Because if it's the 1990s stuff, if it's the same old stuff that Bill Clinton believed, we have a big problem.
Yep.
That is going to fail. That is going to fail. It is going to fail on every level, political, policy, and all the way along. And we'll end up, you know, with a failed presidency, and God only knows, Tom Cotton for president in 2020, which, you know, they're clearing the way for him to run in 2020. You know, I don't know if you read that they're well, it's against the law for a sitting senator to run for president in Arkansas, and they just changed the law in Arkansas so he could run in 2020. I'm not kidding.
Oh my God.
I mean, you know, oh my God, you know, so we can't afford a failed Clinton presidency. Let's just put it that way. We just can't. So,
well,
you know.
Digby, we're gonna talk more and more over the next 20 months, because it's going to be fascinating. That's going to be a fascinating question, and I think there's there's another question on the other side. Is, you know, is this going to be is this going to be the time where you start to see some of the, you know, are we entering into the era of Tom Cotton, where they actually ascend? They no longer are just sort of, you know, the other guys on the podium, but whether or not they actually ascend. But Digby, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Sam.